What if the most valuable thing in the world wasn't made of gold or stock certificates, but of maple, spruce, and memory? And what if the only person who knew its true worth was the one person nobody saw? This question hung, unspoken, in the gilded air of Aurelia, a restaurant in the heart of Manhattan so exclusive that its reservation list was a testament to power, not hunger. Here, whispers could seal billion-dollar mergers, and a single glance could torpedo a career. Into this world moved Alara Vance, 22 years old, a ghost in a crisp black uniform. She was an expert in the art of invisibility, her movements a silent ballet of refilling water glasses and clearing plates, her face a polite, forgettable mask. For 2 years, she had served the city's titans, listening to their triumphs and tribulations, all while her own story, her real story, was locked away, gathering dust like the violin case hidden under her bed in a tiny Brooklyn walk-up. The Juilliard dream, the scent of wood shavings in her father's workshop, the vibrant hum of a string quartet, it all felt like a life lived by someone else. But tonight was different. Tonight, at the coveted corner table with its panoramic view of the glittering city, sat Julian Croft. At 38, he was less a man and more a modern prince, inheritor of a colossal fortune built on steel and logistics. He had a reputation for being ruthless in the boardroom and devastatingly bored everywhere else. He collected companies, yachts, and rare instruments with the same detached, acquisitive coolness, unaware that the young woman placing his heirloom tomato salad before him possessed a knowledge of violins that would dwarf his own. Fate, it seems, doesn't care for tax brackets. Sometimes it throws two souls together in a crucible of crystal and linen, just to see what happens. Alara had trained herself to filter the noise of Aurelia, to hear only the request for more bread or the discreet call for a check. But Julian Croft's voice cut through the hum. It was low, laced with a weary cynicism that she found more grating than the overt arrogance of other patrons. "It's just another acquisition, Philip," he was saying to his companion, a harried-looking man in a suit a half-size too tight. "We buy the patent, strip the assets, and absorb their engineering team. The market rewards efficiency, not sentiment." Ilara's fingers, steady as a surgeon's, almost faltered as she poured Pellegrino. Her father had been a man of sentiment. He believed a violin wasn't just an asset, it was a vessel for a soul. He had spent a decade crafting his magnum opus, an instrument he called the Serafina, so named because he said it sang with the voice of an angel. It was his legacy, his masterpiece, the thing that was supposed to secure their future. Instead, it had destroyed them. She saw Julian Croft glance at her, his gaze dismissive, cataloging her as just another part of the restaurant's expensive decor. He saw the uniform, the tightly pinned bun of brown hair, the deferential dip of her head. He didn't see the faint silvery scars on her fingertips, or the way her thumb and index finger maintained a fractional distance, a muscle memory of holding a bow that 3 years of serving tables couldn't erase. He didn't see the fire banked deep in her hazel eyes. To him, she was no one, a function, not a person. "Will there be anything else, sir?" she asked, her voice a practiced, neutral whisper. He waved a hand, a gesture of impatient dismissal. "We're fine." As she retreated, she felt the familiar burn of helplessness. It was the same feeling that had consumed her when Marcus Thorne, a man with a collector's avarice and a shark's smile, had walked out of her father's workshop with the Serafina, leaving behind a contract full of loopholes and a check that barely covered the cost of the rare wood. Her father, a brilliant artist but a naive businessman, had been ruined. The heart attack had come 6 months later. Alara had been forced to drop out of Juilliard, sell the workshop, and take the first job she could find that would pay the mountain of medical debt. The world of music, once her entire universe, was now a locked room she couldn't bear to enter. But the memory of Thorne's triumphant smirk was a wound that never healed. Later, as she served dessert to a nearby table, a new arrival at Julian Croft's table made her blood run cold. It was him. Marcus Thorne, older now, his silver hair impeccably coiffed, his suit radiating an aura of untouchable wealth. He greeted Julian with a familiar warmth that turned Alara's stomach to ice. "Julian, my boy, wonderful to see you," Thorne boomed, his voice oozing a false bonhomie that she remembered all too well. "Marcus," Julian replied, his tone flat, though he stood to shake the man's hand. "I wasn't aware you were in town. Just flew in for the gala, the annual Art for Aspirations benefit. You're coming, of course. I'm the chair this year." Thorne settled into his seat, preening like a vulture. "In fact, I have a special piece for the auction, something that will get the collectors buzzing. A remarkable violin I discovered a few years ago, a contemporary masterpiece by a forgotten luthier. I've named it the Thorne Requiem." Ilara, standing in the shadows by a service station, felt the dessert plates in her hands tremble. The Thorne Requiem. He had stolen her father's work, his legacy, and now he was branding it with his own name. He was going to auction off her father's soul to the highest bidder. In that moment, the carefully constructed walls around her heart didn't just crack, they shattered. The ghost in the black uniform began to fade, and in her place a daughter's righteous fury began to stir. She looked from Thorne's smug face to Julian Croft's bored one, and a desperate, impossible idea began to take root in her mind. It was insane. It was terrifying. But it was all she had left. The next few days were a blur of simmering rage and meticulous planning for Ilara. She worked her shifts at Aurelia on autopilot, her mind a whirlwind of fragmented memories and desperate calculations. She could hear her father's voice, explaining the unique grain of the Bosnian maple he'd used for the Serafina's back, the secret mixture of resins in his varnish that gave it a warm, golden glow. She remembered the tiny, deliberate imperfection he'd worked into the scrollwork, a small, stylized carving of a starling, his wife's favorite bird, hidden within the curls of the wood. "Every perfect thing needs one secret flaw, Ellie girl," he used to say. "It's what makes it real. It's my signature, for those who know where to look." No one knew where to look. No one but her. Her first instinct was to go to the police, to find a lawyer. But she had tried that 3 years ago. She had been a distraught 19-year-old with a story about a bad deal, armed with her father's heartfelt letters, but lacking the one thing that mattered, the fraudulent contract, which Thorne's lawyers had made sure disappeared. Against Marcus Thorne, a celebrated philanthropist and patron of the arts, her claims had sounded like the hysterical ramblings of a grieving daughter. She was dismissed politely but firmly. She had no money, no influence, no proof. This time had to be different. The auction was her only stage, her one chance to confront Thorne in a room full of people whose opinions he valued. But she couldn't do it alone. She needed an ally, someone whose voice was louder than hers, someone Thorne couldn't simply brush aside. She needed Julian Croft. The problem was, Julian Croft barely knew she existed. To him, she was furniture that moved. She needed to make him see her. Her opportunity came 2 nights before the gala. Croft was dining alone, a rare occurrence. He was staring at a tablet, his brow furrowed in concentration. The restaurant was quieter than usual, a soft hum of conversation, a backdrop to the clinking of cutlery. As she approached his table to refill his water, she noticed what he was looking at. It was an online auction catalog for rare manuscripts. His finger was hovering over a listing for a first edition score of Vivaldi's The Four Seasons. "It's a beautiful edition," she said, her voice quiet but clear. The words were out before she could stop them. Julian Croft looked up, startled. His eyes, a cool, penetrating gray, held a flicker of annoyance at being interrupted. "I'm sorry?" "The Vivaldi score," she clarified, nodding towards his tablet. "It's a first edition, yes, but it's the Venetian print from 1725. The Amsterdam edition from the same year has fewer engraving errors and is generally considered the more definitive version, especially in the Winter Concerto." He stared at her, his mask of indifference cracking for the first time. He slowly put the tablet down. "And how would a waitress know that?" The question wasn't entirely mocking. It was laced with genuine curiosity. "My father was a historian before he was a luthier," she said, the partial truth feeling safer than the whole. "He collected rare scores. He taught me what to look for." She saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a reevaluation. She had ceased to be invisible. "A luthier?" he asked, leaning forward slightly. "A violin maker?" "Yes, sir." He studied her for a long moment. "I have a Stradivarius at home, a 1715 Titian. Do you know it?" He was testing her. "Of course," she said without hesitation. "Known for its powerful, brilliant tone and the stunning red-orange varnish. It's said that Stradivari used a ground layer of silica and potash. My father believed the secret was in the way he treated the wood before he ever started carving." Julian's eyebrows rose. He had paid a team of experts a small fortune for that same information. He looked at her hands, really looked at them this time, and saw the faint calluses. He saw the way she stood, her posture perfect, her shoulders back, the poise not of a servant, but of a performer. "You play," he stated. It wasn't a question. A wave of pain washed over Alara's face, so raw and unguarded that it took him aback. "I used to," she whispered, her professional veneer dissolving. She quickly regained her composure. "Is there anything else I can get for you, Mr. Croft?" "Wait," he said, his voice softer now. "Don't go." He gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Sit for a minute." It was a breach of every rule at Aurelia. A waitress did not sit with a guest. Her manager, a stern man named Dubois, would have fired her on the spot. But she looked at Julian Croft's face and saw not a command, but a genuine request. She glanced around. Dubois was in the back office. She took the risk. She sat. "What's your name?" he asked. "Elara Vance." "Elara," he repeated, testing the sound of it. "Tell me why you stopped playing." And so, in the hushed, expensive quiet of Aurelia, the story she had held inside for 3 years began to spill out. She told him about her father, the artist. She told him about the Serafina, the culmination of his life's work. And she told him about Marcus Thorne, the charming predator who had stolen it all. She didn't cry. Her voice was low and steady, fueled by a cold, hard anger that was more compelling than any tears. When she finished, Julian was silent for a long time, his steepled fingers hiding his mouth. He was a man accustomed to lies and manipulation in business. His world was full of people trying to get something from him. His initial instinct was skepticism. A waitress with a sob story about a world-renowned philanthropist? It sounded like a screenplay. "Marcus Thorne is one of the most respected collectors in the world," he said carefully, watching her reaction. "His reputation is impeccable. What you're alleging, it's career suicide for him. Why would he risk it over one violin, no matter how magnificent?" "Because he thought no one was looking," Elara shot back, her eyes flashing. "He saw my father, a humble craftsman without connections, and he saw an opportunity. He preys on people he perceives as weak, and he was right. My father had no recourse. I had no recourse." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to an intense whisper. "But the violin has proof of its own. My father built his story into the wood. Thorne doesn't know it. He sees it as an object, an asset. He doesn't know its secrets." She told him about the hidden starling carved into the scrollwork. Julian was intrigued. It was a detail, a tangible piece of evidence in a sea of hearsay. His cynicism was a fortress, but Alara's conviction was a battering ram. He had dealt with Marcus Thorne before in business. He knew the man's reputation for public charity was matched only by his reputation for private ruthlessness. What Elara described fit the man he knew behind the facade. "The Art for Aspirations Gala is in 2 days," he said, more to himself than to her. "Thorne is auctioning it off." "I know," she said. "That's my last chance. If that violin is sold, its provenance will be rewritten forever. My father's name will be erased." Her hands were clenched into tight fists on the table. "I have to stop him, and I need your help. I can't even get into the room unless I'm working the event." "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice all business now. "I need a stage," she said, her plan wild and audacious, finally taking full shape. "When he presents the violin, I need a chance to challenge him, and I need a way to prove my claim. I need to play it." Julian stared at her, a slow smile spreading across his face. It was the first genuine smile she had seen from him, and it transformed his severe features. The boredom was gone, replaced by a glint of excitement, the thrill of a game he hadn't expected. This was more interesting than any corporate takeover. This was about legacy, justice, and a secret hidden in a violin. He will laugh you out of the room, Julian warned. He'll call you a delusional waitress looking for a handout. Yes, Alara agreed, a fierce light in her eyes. He will. He'll look at me and see nothing. That is my greatest advantage, and that's when you'll step in. This is insane, he said, but he was already pulling out his phone. He wasn't just a collector of objects, he was a collector of rare opportunities, and this was the rarest of them all. Insane I can work with. Dubois is going to fire you for this. Let him, Alara said, standing up, her spine straight and her spirit, for the first time in years, soaring. After Saturday night, I don't think I'll be serving tables anymore. The night of the Art for Aspirations Gala, Aurelia was transformed. The already opulent dining room shimmered under the light of extra chandeliers brought in for the occasion. Tables were draped in silver cloth, adorned with towering floral arrangements. The air, thick with the scent of expensive perfume and ambition, buzzed with the conversations of New York's elite. Men in bespoke tuxedos and women in glittering gowns moved through the space, their laughter echoing off the marble columns. And moving among them, silent and invisible as ever, was Alara. She had convinced her manager, Dubois, to assign her to the gala, claiming she needed the overtime. He had agreed, but not before giving her a stern warning about her unprofessional chat with Mr. Croft a few nights prior. She wore her standard uniform, a stark black and white contrast to the vibrant colors of the guests. In her pocket, her fingers nervously traced the outline of a small, worn violin rosin, a final token from her father's workshop she always kept with her. Her heart hammered against her ribs with a frantic rhythm that felt like a drum solo. Every detail of her plan with Julian had been rehearsed. He had arrived an hour earlier, taking a prominent table near the small stage where the auction would take place. He'd given her a single, almost imperceptible nod as he passed, his face an unreadable mask of aristocratic calm. He had his own people here, an acoustics expert and a world-renowned appraiser posing as guests. They were his insurance policy, but the main performance, he had made clear, was hers alone. Nervous, a voice whispered near her ear. It was another waitress, a kind girl named Maria. Alara forced a smile. A little. It's a big crowd. Tell me about it, Maria said, rolling her eyes. Table 7 wants their champagne chilled to exactly 8 degrees Celsius. Not 7, not 9. 8. As if they could tell the difference. The small talk was a brief, welcome anchor to reality. But then she saw him. Marcus Thorne was holding court near the stage, accepting compliments and congratulations, his face flushed with self-importance. He was the master of ceremonies, the benevolent king of this gilded world. And on a velvet-draped pedestal beside the auctioneer's podium, under a dedicated spotlight, was the Serafina. Alara's breath caught in her throat. It was even more beautiful than she remembered. The varnish seemed to drink the light, glowing with an inner fire. Even from across the room, she could see the exquisite craftsmanship, the perfect lines, the soul her father had poured into the wood. A wave of grief and fury washed over her, so potent it nearly buckled her knees. She gripped her serving tray, her knuckles white. Not now, she told herself. Wait for the moment. After the main course, Thorne took the stage to a round of enthusiastic applause. He beamed, soaking in the adoration. Friends, colleagues, fellow lovers of art, he began, his voice smooth as aged whiskey. Tonight we have the distinct privilege of auctioning a truly unique piece, a masterpiece that I was fortunate enough to rescue from obscurity. He gestured dramatically towards the violin. I call it the Thorne Requiem. Crafted by a reclusive, unknown luthier, it is an instrument of unparalleled quality and soul. Its voice has been silent for too long. Tonight, one of you will have the honor of becoming its new guardian, and in doing so, will support the aspiring young artists of our great city. A polite murmur of appreciation went through the crowd. The auctioneer stepped forward, ready to begin. The bidding was set to start at $500,000. This was it. Alara's heart pounded in her ears. She looked at Julian. He met her gaze across the room and gave a slow, deliberate blink. The stage is yours. Taking a deep breath, she set her tray down on a nearby service stand. She straightened her uniform, smoothed her apron, and began to walk toward the stage. Not around the tables, but straight through the center of the room. A hush began to fall as people noticed her. A waitress walking with purpose, not to serve, but to interrupt. Heads turned, conversations faltered. By the time she reached the foot of the stage, the room was nearly silent. Thorne, who had been conferring with the auctioneer, turned to see what the commotion was about. His eyes landed on Alara, and a look of confusion, then irritation, crossed his face. "Can I help you, miss?" he asked, his tone dripping with condescension, loud enough for everyone to hear. "If you need to clear the glasses, you can wait until we are finished." Alara didn't flinch. She met his gaze directly. "My name is Alara Vance," she said, her voice clear and steady, amplified by the sudden silence. "And I am here to talk about that violin." Thorne's smile tightened. "I'm afraid you're mistaken. This is a private event." He signaled for security. Two large men in black suits started to move towards her from the sides of the room. "That violin has another name," Alara continued, her voice rising in volume, refusing to be silenced. "It is called the Serafina, and it was not made by an unknown luthier. It was made by my father, Elias Vance. And you, Mr. Thorne, you didn't rescue it. You stole it." A collective gasp went through the room. The silence was shattered, replaced by a cacophony of shocked whispers. Thorne's face went from pink to a blotchy, furious red. "This is absurd," he sputtered. "Security, remove this delusional woman immediately. She is clearly unwell, probably looking for a payout." He laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "What would a waitress know about a violin like this? It's preposterous." The security guards reached Alara, each taking one of her arms. She didn't struggle. She had expected this. She looked past Thorne, past the shocked faces in the crowd, and locked eyes with Julian Croft again. "Now." "Wait," Julian's calm, authoritative voice cut through the chaos like a razor. He stood up from his table, commanding the attention of the entire room. The security guards froze, instinctively recognizing a greater power than Thorne. "Let her speak." Thorne whirled around to face him. "Julian, what is the meaning of this? Are you siding with this servant?" "I'm siding with the truth, Marcus," Julian said, his voice dangerously quiet as he walked toward the stage. "And I find myself curious. The girl makes a very specific claim. It should be easy enough to disprove, shouldn't it?" Thorne was trapped. To refuse would look like he had something to hide. To the outside world, this was a clash of titans, and he was losing control. "This is a ridiculous waste of time," he snarled. "Then let's waste it," Julian said smoothly. He turned to Alara. "You said there was proof, something hidden." Alara nodded, her composure absolute. "On the scroll," she said, her voice ringing with conviction as she addressed the entire room. "At the top of the violin, my father was a master carver. Within the traditional vollet, he carved a tiny, perfect starling, hidden in the final turn of the wood. It was his secret signature." A wave of murmurs swept the room. It was such a specific, obscure detail. Thorne's face went pale. He knew every inch of that violin as an asset, but he had never looked at it with the eyes of love, with the intimacy of a creator's daughter. He had no idea if the bird was there or not. "Show them," Julian commanded the auctioneer. The nervous auctioneer picked up the violin. An assistant brought a camera over, projecting a close-up image onto the large screens on either side of the stage. The camera zoomed in on the scroll, tracing the elegant curves of the polished wood. And then, there it was, tucked into the deepest part of the spiral, so small it was almost invisible unless you knew exactly where to look, was the unmistakable shape of a tiny, carved bird. The room erupted. The shocked whispers became a roar of disbelief and accusation. Marcus Thorne looked as if he'd been struck by lightning. He stared at the screen, then at Alara, his face a mask of pure hatred. He was exposed, humiliated in front of the very people whose respect he craved. "It proves nothing," he bellowed, his voice cracking with desperation. "A coincidence, a forger's mark." "There is one more piece of proof," Alara said, her voice cutting through his panicked shouts. She looked at the Serafina, not as an object of dispute, but with a deep, familial longing. My father didn't just build that violin. He wrote music for it, a specific piece, a sonata designed to showcase its unique resonance, its soul. He called it Ilara's Song. Let me play it. Let the violin speak for itself. Thorne let out a final derisive laugh, a cornered animal's snarl. You, play it? You're just a waitress. Julian Croft stepped forward, a cold, predatory smile on his lips. I believe the young lady has made a reasonable request. Unless you're afraid of what it might say? The challenge hung in the air, thick and heavy. The crowd, now completely on Ilara's side, murmured in agreement. Defeated, Thorne stumbled back, his face ashen. The auctioneer, taking his cue from Julian, reverently handed the violin and its bow to Ilara. She stepped onto the stage, the wood warm and familiar in her hands. The cheap polyester uniform felt ridiculous as she tucked the instrument under her chin. For a moment she was terrified. 3 years of silence, 3 years of grief and rage. What if her fingers failed her? What if the music was gone? She closed her eyes, shutting out the hundreds of staring faces, the glittering jewels, the weight of expectation. She shut out Marcus Thorne and Julian Croft. She was back in her father's workshop, the scent of sawdust and varnish in the air. She could hear his gentle voice. Feel the music, Ellie girl. Don't just play the notes. Tell the story. She drew the bow across the strings. The first note was a whisper, a question mark hanging in the breathless silence of the room. It was hesitant, fragile. Then a second note joined it, stronger, clearer. Her fingers, guided by a memory deeper than thought, found their places on the fingerboard. The muscle memory, the years of relentless practice, the soul of the musician she had been, all of it came rushing back in a tidal wave. And then she wasn't just playing. She was testifying. The music that poured from the Serafina was unlike anything the audience had ever heard. It wasn't a technical display of pyrotechnics. It was a story. The melody began with a simple, hopeful theme, the sound of a man choosing wood, of a dream taking shape. It built in complexity and passion, the notes soaring with the joy of creation. The violin sang with a voice that was rich, powerful, and achingly human. It filled every corner of the vast room, a living, breathing entity. Then the music shifted. A darker, dissonant chord intruded, the theme of deception and theft. The tempo grew frantic, chaotic, a musical depiction of loss and heartbreak. This was her father's despair, her own grief. The sound that bled from the Serafina, was not merely music. It was a confession, an accusation, a eulogy. The first movement was a hymn to creation, the memory of her father's hands, calloused and gentle, coaxing life from a block of Bosnian maple. Ilara could smell the ghost of wood shavings and rosin, feel the quiet joy of the workshop as the melody soared, vibrant and full of the hope that had once been their entire world. The audience, a sea of glittering jewels and tailored silk, leaned in, their polite curiosity slowly morphing into rapt attention. Then the tone fractured. A dissonant, grating chord sliced through the harmony, the sound of a serpent's smile and a fraudulent contract. The tempo became a frantic, panicked heartbeat. This was the music of betrayal. Her bow arm moved with a vicious, controlled fury, each downstroke a hammer blow against the injustice, each upstroke a cry of despair. She played the collapse of their lives, the frantic phone calls, the bank notices, the hollowing out of her father's eyes. Tears were a saltwater baptism on the polished wood, blurring the faces in the front row into halos of indifferent light. But her hands were not her own. They belonged to her father's memory, to the 10,000 hours of practice, to a covenant made in a dusty workshop years ago. She was no longer a waitress in a cheap uniform. She was a vessel, a conduit for a truth that had been silenced for 3 years. The final movement was a lament, born in the sterile quiet of a hospital room and nurtured in the lonely anonymity of a Brooklyn walk-up. The melody was achingly spare, each note a tear shed in private. It spoke of grief so profound it felt like a missing limb. But as the movement progressed, a new theme emerged from beneath the sorrow. It was a single defiant note, repeated, building in strength and resolve. It was the sound of a promise made at a graveside, the hardening of a daughter's heart, the birth of a righteous fire. The lament did not simply end. It transformed, resolving not into a happy major key, but into a chord of fierce, unwavering strength. It was not the sound of healing, but the sound of a warrior finding her weapon. The last note hung in the air, a shimmering, resonant thread that seemed to stitch the entire room together in its spell. It vibrated in the crystal champagne flutes, in the marble columns, in the very bones of everyone present. Then it faded, and the silence that followed was more profound, more damning than any sound could ever be. For a full 10 seconds, the world was a vacuum. Elara stood, chest heaving, the bow hanging limply from her fingers, the violin feeling impossibly heavy, its story finally spent. She looked out, her vision clearing, and saw not a crowd, but a collection of individual faces, each one a portrait of raw, unguarded emotion. A woman in emeralds was openly weeping into a linen napkin. A notoriously ruthless hedge fund manager stared at the stage, his mouth slightly agape, his face stripped of its usual predatory cynicism. She had done more than play for them. She had unmade them, stripping away their armor of wealth and status to reveal the simple human heart beneath. Her gaze found Julian Croft. He was not applauding. He was simply watching her, and in his cool gray eyes she saw the last vestiges of his boredom and detachment, being consumed by a fire of awe and profound respect. He saw her, not as a cause or a project, but as a force of nature. The silence was finally shattered by Marcus Thorne. "A touching performance," he boomed, his voice a grotesque parody of magnanimity. He began to applaud, a slow, deliberate clap meant to reclaim control, to frame her testimony as mere entertainment. Truly, a very moving piece of theater. It's a shame the girl is so deeply troubled. A wonderful imagination. It was the wrong move. His attempt to dismiss her, to reassert his power, was like trying to patch a dam break with a piece of tape. The spell was broken, but not in his favor. A low murmur rippled through the audience, a sound of disgust. They had been witnesses, and they would not allow their experience to be invalidated. Before the murmur could grow into a roar, Julian stood. He did not raise his voice. He did not have to. "The performance is over, Marcus," he said, his voice carrying with chilling precision across the room. "But the accounting is just beginning." He gave a subtle nod, and the two men who had been posing as his guests, the appraiser and the acoustics expert, stood as well, their faces grim and professional. Thorne's face, a mask of jovial condescension just moments before, crumpled into a snarl of pure hatred. He looked at Elara, at Julian, at the hostile faces of his peers. He was a king whose subjects had just discovered he was a fraud. He turned, not fleeing in shame, but stalking off the stage like a cornered animal, shoving past a waiter and disappearing through a service door. The empire had not just crumbled, it had been revealed as a mirage. The applause came then, not the polite patter of a society gala, but a thunderous, visceral roar of affirmation that washed over Elara. It was a verdict, a coronation, but she barely heard it. The adrenaline that had sustained her, the righteous fury that had fueled her, drained away in an instant, leaving behind an exhaustion so deep it was structural. Her knees buckled. Before she could fall, Julian was there. He had crossed the room and mounted the stage in a few long strides. He didn't touch her. He simply took the Seraphina from her nerveless grasp, his hands treating it with a reverence he had never before afforded an object. He passed it carefully to the waiting appraiser. Only then did he turn back to Elara, offering his arm. "Let's go, Miss Vance," he said softly, his voice for her alone. "The curtain has fallen." She took his arm, and the solid, living warmth of it was the only thing that kept her from dissolving into the floor. The aftermath was not a clean victory, but a brutal, grinding war of attrition fought in the sterile corridors of law offices and the muddy trenches of public opinion. Thorne's disappearance from the gala was temporary. He resurfaced 2 days later, flanked by a team of lawyers so formidable they were known in legal circles as the Praetorian Guard. His strategy was simple and savage: bury Elara. They filed preemptive lawsuits, painting her as a disturbed and manipulative extortionist. They produced a sworn affidavit from a disgruntled former apprentice of her father's, bribed into claiming that Elias Vance was a drunk whose work was shoddy. They leaked a carefully edited psychiatric evaluation from Ilara's teenage years, sought after her mother's death, to suggest a history of delusional episodes. They were not fighting the facts, they were assassinating the witness. "This is how they operate," Julian explained, his voice a low growl. They were in a conference room that felt more like a war room, papers and legal documents covering a vast mahogany table. The Serafina rested in its case in the corner, a silent monarch presiding over the battle for its soul. They don't engage with the truth. They create so much noise, so much filth, that ordinary people can't tell the difference. For Ilara, it was a waking nightmare. Every morning brought a new, ugly headline, a fresh character assault. The triumph of the gala felt like a distant dream. She was no longer the avenging angel in the spotlight, but a target, pinned down by a sniper's scope. Doubt, a cold and insidious poison, began to seep into the cracks of her exhaustion. What if they succeeded? What if, after all this, the world chose to believe the lie because it was shouted louder? One afternoon, during a particularly grueling deposition, Thorne's lead counsel, a woman with eyes like chips of ice, leaned across the table. "Ms. Vance," she said, her voice silk over steel, "you claim this violin has a soul. You claim it spoke the truth. These are the words of a poet, or perhaps a child, not of a credible witness. Tell me, do you often have conversations with inanimate objects?" Ilara felt a flush of rage and humiliation. She looked to her own lawyer, then to Julian, who sat at the end of the table, his face an unreadable mask of stone. He gave her a slow, almost imperceptible nod. "Your fight." Ilara took a deep breath, the lawyer's condescending smirk fueling her. "A soul isn't something you can list on a balance sheet, counsel," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "It's the aggregate of intention, of love, of sacrifice. It's the 10 years my father poured into that instrument instead of taking vacations. It's the choice of wood he agonized over for months. It's the starling he carved into the scroll, a secret love letter to my dead mother. Marcus Thorne sees an asset to be leveraged. I see my father's hands. Perhaps the issue isn't my credibility, but your client's complete and utter lack of perception." The icy lawyer's smile faltered. For the first time, a crack appeared in her composure. In that moment, Ilara realized that the truth, spoken plainly and without apology, was a weapon they had no defense for. The turning point came not from a legal maneuver, but from an act of quiet rebellion. Julian's investigators, digging into Thorne's past, found a pattern. They found an elderly luthier in Cremona, a weaver in Peru, a ceramicist in Japan, all brilliant, unknown artisans who had done business with Thorne and come away with a fraction of their work's value and a story of quiet heartbreak. None had the resources or the will to fight. Julian didn't leak the stories to the press. Instead, he arranged for them to tell their stories via video conference directly to the board of the city's most prestigious museum, of which Thorne was the chairman. Faced with a clear, documented history of predation against the very artists their institution claimed to champion, the board's position became untenable. They voted to remove him. It was a mortal blow to his public standing, the first domino in a long, inevitable line. One evening, weeks into the legal slog, Ilara found Julian in his music room, standing before his glass case containing the 1715 Titian Stradivarius. He was staring at it, not with an owner's pride, but with a stranger's curiosity. "I paid $11 million for this," he said without turning around. "I bought its provenance, its history, its documented chain of ownership. I know who owned it in 1950, in 1880, in 1790. But I don't know the first thing about the man who held it when the varnish was still fresh. I don't know if he had children or if he preferred playing in the morning or late at night." He turned to face her, his eyes holding a new, unguarded vulnerability. "You didn't just reclaim a violin, Ilara. You reminded me that these things aren't just assets. They are phylacteries. They hold lives. I spent my whole life acquiring things, and you You've made me realize I don't truly own any of them. It was in that moment that their relationship was forged into something new. They were no longer a billionaire and a waitress, a patron and a project. They were two people who had, from opposite ends of the universe, found a shared piece of solid ground, a belief that some things like legacy and truth were worth fighting for. Faced with a collapsed public image and a legal case fortified by Julian's inexhaustible resources, Thorne finally capitulated. His lawyers offered a settlement, the unconditional return of the Serafina, a public retraction and apology, in a staggering 8-figure sum for damages. Take it, her lawyer advised. It's an absolute win. You'll never have to worry about money again. Ilara looked at Julian. He remained silent, letting the decision be hers. She thought of her father, a man who had never cared for money, only for the integrity of his work. A settlement was a transaction. This was about restoration. No, she said, her voice clear and final. No settlement. We are going to court. I don't want his money. I want a judgment. I want my father's name, Elias Vance, read into a court record and declared the sole and true creator of the Serafina. His legacy won't be purchased back with hush money. It will be recorded as a matter of law. Julian's rare, genuine smile broke across his face. I was hoping you'd say that, he murmured. The court case was a formality, a ghost of a battle already won. Thorne pleaded no contest. The judge's gavel came down like the final chord of a symphony, and the name Elias Vance was etched into the permanent, unassailable record of the law. Victory was a strange, quiet country. With the legal battles over, the world rushed in, eager to claim Ilara Vance, the prodigy reborn. Juilliard offered her a full scholarship named in her father's honor. Conductors from Berlin to Boston called her agent, an agent Julian had insisted she hire. She was a story, a symbol, a sensation, but inside she was a ruin. She had poured every ounce of her being into the fight, and now that it was over, she was hollow. She would go into Julian's music room, pick up the Serafina, and feel nothing. The instrument that had spoken with such fire and fury at the gala was now silent in her hands. Her fingers felt like clumsy alien things. When she tried to play Bach, a piece she had once known so well she could play it in her sleep, her mind went blank. The notes on the page were a foreign language. The rage had been her fuel, and without it, the engine of her music would not start. One night she broke down, sliding to the floor of the music room, the violin on her lap, silent tears of frustration tracking paths through the rosin dust on her cheeks. She wasn't a virtuoso. She was a one-song wonder, and that song had been a howl of pain. Julian found her there. He didn't speak, didn't offer empty words of encouragement. He walked to the glass case, removed his own priceless Stradivarius, and sat down on the floor a few feet away from her. He didn't play it. He just held it. Tell me about the starling, he said, his voice soft in the quiet room. Confused, she looked up. What? The carving. Your father's secret signature. Tell me why he chose it. And so she told him. She spoke of her mother, who had loved the birds that nested outside the workshop window, who believed their complex, chattering songs were gossip from a better world. She described how, after her mother passed, her father would fall silent for hours, just watching them, and how carving one into his masterpiece was his way of ensuring her mother's spirit would always be part of his music. As she spoke, her fingers found the scroll of the Serafina, tracing the hidden bird. She wasn't thinking about technique or performance. She was just remembering. She was connecting with the love that had been the violin's true genesis, a force far older and more powerful than the hate that had fueled her performance at the gala. Without conscious thought, she lifted the Serafina to her chin, her bow finding the strings. She didn't play her father's sonata. She didn't play Bach. She played a simple folk melody her mother used to hum, a tune as simple and pure as a drop of water. The notes were hesitant at first, then clearer, fuller. The music wasn't fiery or brilliant. It was gentle. It was quiet. It was a beginning. Julian listened, his head bowed, the Stradivarius resting silently in his lap. He was not a patron listening to a prodigy. He was a man listening to a friend find her way out of the dark. 6 months later, the velvet curtains of Carnegie Hall parted. The stage was empty but for a single chair and a music stand. Ilara Vance walked out, not to the thunderous applause of a sensation, but to the warm, welcoming applause of an audience that knew her story. She wore a simple black dress, the Serafina held not like a weapon, but like an extension of her own body. She took her seat, and as the hall fell into a reverent hush, she sought out one face in the front row. Julian Croft met her gaze, his expression one of quiet, unwavering belief. She took a breath, closing her eyes, feeling the familiar weight of the wood against her collarbone. This was not a performance. It was an arrival. She wasn't reclaiming a past that had been stolen. She was stepping into a future she had built, note by painful, deliberate note. She began, not with the fiery sonata of her father, but with the quiet, intricate solitude of Bach's Chaconne in D minor. It was a piece that contained the whole of human experience: joy, sorrow, despair, and transcendence. Her playing was no longer just the product of grief and fury. It was layered now, imbued with the hard-won wisdom of her fight, the quiet strength of her friendship with Julian, and the gentle love of her parents' memory. The music was a testament not to what she had lost, but to all she had painstakingly rebuilt. The ghost in the uniform was gone forever. The girl in the workshop lived on in every note, and the woman on the stage, a master of her own story at last, was finally truly free.